Morning came slow and gray, the storm having left the land washed clean but quiet. The manor's windows dripped with dew, and a faint mist clung to the hills beyond Hollow Creek. Inside, the great house was still, save for the faint sound of footsteps, small ones, echoing down the corridor. Henry Alcott, the Baron, stood at his study window, staring out across the pasture lands that once bustled with life. Now the fences leaned, the stables sagged, and the fields lay bare. He had let everything fade just as he had faded himself, but today something felt different. The echoes of laughter he thought long gone were creeping back into these walls. He could hear the children's soft voices downstairs, Mrs. Keene fussing over breakfast, the clatter of spoons. Sounds of life, sounds the house had not known in years. He turned to the fireplace where a framed photograph sat half buried in dust. It was of Daniel Harper and himself, taken nearly 15 years ago. Two younger men, one proud and noble, the other bright-eyed and strong. Daniel had worked the Baron's land with loyalty unmatched. Henry could still recall the morning Daniel had ridden out to defend his property from outlaws, the day everything went wrong. He'd been the one who should have taken that bullet, not Daniel. A knock on the door drew him from his memories. Thomas stood there, his hair brushed neatly, his sister's doll tucked under one arm. Mrs. Keene said, "I should thank you, sir," the boy said, voice steady but polite. Henry gestured for him to enter. "Come in, lad, sit." Thomas obeyed, perching carefully on the edge of the chair across from the desk. His eyes roamed over the bookshelves, the maps on the walls, the strange stillness of the room. "Did you know my pa?" he asked suddenly. Henry hesitated. "Yes," he said softly. "Better than most. Was he brave?" Henry nodded. "Braver than I deserved. Your father, he saved my life." The boy's expression didn't change, but his hands tightened on the doll. "Mama said he was good. She said you was good too." Those words hit harder than he expected. You was good too. Henry felt the weight of years pressing on him. Years of silence, of shutting the world out while Daniel's family struggled alone. "I should have come sooner," he murmured almost to himself. "Sir?" He looked up and forced a faint smile. "Nothing, Thomas. Tell me, how did your mother fare after—" He couldn't bring himself to say after Daniel died. Thomas's eyes dimmed. "She tried real hard, sir. Worked at the mill, took in sewing. Then she got sick. Fever took her. She said she'd see Pa soon, but that we had to find you first." Henry's throat tightened. For a long moment he couldn't speak. He reached for the silver watch lying on his desk, a watch he'd meant to give Daniel the day he died. He opened it, the ticking faint but steady, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. He closed the watch and placed it in the boy's hand. "Your father meant the world to me. That watch was his by right. You keep it now." Thomas's eyes widened. "Thank you, sir." Henry nodded, then stood, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. "Go on now. See if Mrs. Keene's got breakfast ready for you and your sister. You'll find no shortage of work to do here if you're willing." "Yes, sir," Thomas said, and gave a small, proud nod before leaving. When the door closed, Henry sank back into his chair. The old house around him seemed to breathe again, warmed by the voices of children, by a promise that fate had forced him to remember. The ghosts that had once haunted him were not gone, but for the first time they no longer whispered of regret. They whispered of a second chance. The days that followed brought a quiet transformation to Hollow Creek Manor. The once still corridors that had echoed only with wind, and memory began to hum again with the soft rhythm of life. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, painting the floors with gold. The house that had been a tomb of silence for years now stirred with laughter, footsteps, and the simple noise of belonging. Thomas rose early every morning, just as his father once had. He followed the Baron to the stables, his boots too large, his hair sticking out from beneath a hat that didn't quite fit. Henry would find him already busy, trying to brush down the horses or haul buckets of feed twice his size. The sight often drew a rare, hidden smile from the Baron. "You've got your father's hands," Henry remarked one morning, watching the boy struggle to lift a saddle. Thomas grinned. "Mama said Pa worked hard. Said I should too." Henry handed him a smaller bridle, his voice gentler than before. "Aye, and he'd be proud to see you doing just that." In the kitchen, little Lily had taken to following Mrs. Keene like a shadow. She helped fold napkins and wash vegetables, her small humming filling the air. The housekeeper, once so strict and joyless, began to soften under the girl's sweetness. She even started baking again. Fresh bread, pies, things Henry hadn't tasted since his wife's passing. At first, Henry tried to keep his distance. He'd tell himself that they were only guests, that he was merely honoring an old debt. But as days turned into weeks, that distance began to crumble. He found himself pausing in the doorway when he heard Lily's laughter echo down the hall, or stopping his work just to watch Thomas gallop across the field on one of the older ponies. At breakfast, the long dining table, once set for one, now had 3 places laid. Henry hadn't realized how strange it felt to share a meal again until Lily, in her tiny voice, asked him to pass the jam. He did so awkwardly, almost startled by the sound of a child speaking to him so easily. Thomas filled his plate like any hungry boy, eating with the honest appetite of youth. "You eat like a ranch hand already," Henry said, his tone gruff but not unkind. Thomas smiled. "That's 'cause I'm going to work like one too, sir." Mrs. Keene chuckled softly from the sideboard. "He'll have your whole estate back in order by spring if he keeps at it." Henry didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on the boy, pride flickering quietly behind his stern eyes. For the first time in years, he began to rise with purpose, to check the fences, to oversee the men who had returned after hearing the Baron was working again. The estate began to live once more just as he did. Evenings brought peace. Lily would curl up on the rug near the fire, her doll in her lap, while Henry sat in his old chair with a book he rarely read. Sometimes Thomas would nod off mid-sentence, his head resting on the arm of the couch. Those were the hours Henry cherished most. He'd glance at them, remembering his own son who once sat by the same fire, small and curious, before the fever took him. One night, as the embers glowed low, Lily looked up at him sleepily. "You don't look so sad anymore, sir." Henry blinked, surprised by her innocence. "No?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "You smile more now." For a long moment he couldn't speak. He reached out and gently tucked a blanket around her small shoulders. "Go to sleep, little one," he whispered. And as the fire crackled and the wind sighed outside, the lonely Baron realized the truth of her words. For the first time in years, he wasn't sad. The ache in his heart was still there, but it no longer hollowed him. It reminded him he was still alive, and that perhaps he was finally home again, too. The storm had rolled in fast over the hills, swallowing Hollow Creek in sheets of rain and wind. The manor sat alone on the ridge, its stone walls gray against the flashes of lightning that ripped the sky open. Inside, the lonely Baron sat before the dying fire, staring at the amber glow that flickered across his empty drawing room. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp velvet, like memories that refused to fade. Henry Alcott, the Baron of Hollow Creek, hadn't entertained a visitor in years. Once the grand house had been filled with voices, his wife's laughter echoing down the staircase, his son's footsteps chasing through the corridors. But now silence reigned. The portraits that lined the hallways stared down at him, reminders of what he'd lost. The townsfolk whispered that the Baron had gone mad with grief, that he'd locked himself away from the world. Perhaps they weren't wrong. Outside, thunder boomed and the wind rattled the windows. Henry leaned back in his chair, letting the storm fill the hollowness in his chest. He almost didn't hear the first knock. It was faint, hesitant, like a ghost asking permission to enter. He frowned and turned his head, thinking the storm was playing tricks on him. But then it came again, firmer this time. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the heavy oak door, his brow furrowed. No one came to Hollow Creek Manor uninvited. The old servants had all left years ago, save for Mrs. Keene, the housekeeper, who lived in the cottage by the stables. Henry reached for his cane, the polished wood tapping against the marble floor as he rose. Another flash of lightning illuminated the corridor ahead, the long hall stretching to the door, its shadows deep and trembling. When he pulled the latch, the wind pushed the door inward, carrying with it a swirl of rain and cold air. 2 figures stood on the threshold, a boy and a little girl drenched to the bone. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, his brown hair plastered to his forehead, his arms wrapped around the shivering child beside him. She clung to a small rag doll, its fabric muddy and torn. Both looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. For a long moment, Henry said nothing. The boy swallowed hard, then took a step forward. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Mama said you'd help us, sir." The words hung in the air like a spell. The Baron's grip on the door tightened. There was something about the boy's voice, something achingly familiar. Henry's heart gave a painful jolt as he looked closer at the child's face. The shape of his chin, the determined set of his eyes, it stirred a memory long buried. "Who's your mother?" Henry asked quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "Mary Harper," the boy said. "She's gone now, sir. She told us to come here. Said you'd keep us safe, Mary Harper." The name struck him like a thunderclap. He knew that name, knew it from another life. Mary was the wife of Daniel Harper, a young soldier who had once worked his land, loyal to the end. Daniel had died protecting the Baron during a bandit raid years ago. Before he died, Henry had promised to look after his family. But grief had swallowed that promise whole. Now here stood Daniel's children on his doorstep, the past knocking in flesh and blood. The boy's eyes met his again, pleading, steady, brave. The Baron felt something deep inside him stir, something he thought had turned to stone. Without another word, he stepped aside, opening the door wide against the storm. "Come in," he said softly. "You're safe here." As the children crossed the threshold, the wind howled one last time before the door shut behind them, sealing the old house against the storm, and awakening the heart of the man who had forgotten what it meant to care. The storm raged long into the night, but inside the manor a small fire crackled, pushing back the cold that had crept into every stone. The Baron, Henry Alcott, watched as Mrs. Keene hurriedly fetched blankets from the linen closet. Her lips pursed in worry as she wrapped them around the two soaked children. The boy sat stiffly on the hearthrug, holding his little sister close while his damp boots steamed before the fire. Henry stood back, silent. The sight of them, two lost souls trembling in his grand empty parlor, stirred an ache in his chest he hadn't felt in years. It was as though the ghosts of his own family had returned wearing new faces. He cleared his throat, unused to speaking aloud, and finally said, "You'd better tell me how you came to be here." The boy looked up. His eyes were too serious for a child's. "We walked, sir, from Ridge Hollow. Took us 2 days," Mrs. Keene gasped. 2 days? Through this weather?" The boy nodded. "Mama, she was sick. We waited, but she said she couldn't go no farther. Before she went to sleep, she said to come here. Said the man in the stone house would help us. Said you were a friend of our pa." Henry sank slowly into the chair beside the fire. The words tightened something deep inside him. "Your father's name," he said, though he already knew the answer. "Daniel Harper, sir." The room seemed to shrink around him. The fire hissed as a log cracked and fell. He could still remember Daniel Harper, the young ranch hand who'd come to him years ago, full of courage and loyalty. Henry had taken to him like a son, and then that day, the raid by the river, bandits, gunfire, chaos. Daniel had thrown himself in front of the Baron, taking the bullet meant for him. The Baron had held the boy as he died, promising to care for his wife and children. But grief and guilt had driven Henry into isolation, and that promise had been buried under the dust of the years. Now Daniel's children were sitting in his parlor, shivering and hungry. Mrs. Keene set down 2 bowls of hot soup, but the little girl, Lily the boy had called her, was too tired to eat. She leaned her head against her brother's shoulder, clutching her ragged doll. Thomas, as he'd introduced himself, gave her the first spoonfuls before taking any for himself. The quiet devotion between them struck Henry deeply. "How old are you, Thomas?" Henry asked gently. 10, sir." "Lily's 6. You came all that way alone?" "Yes, sir." Thomas's chin lifted a little. "Mama said to be brave." Something in the boy's steady tone broke through the Baron's last wall of indifference. He saw not just Daniel's courage in the child's face, but his own lost son, Edward, whose eyes had once held the same fire. The pain hit him so sharply he had to look away. Mrs. Keene spoke softly. "They can stay in the blue room, sir. It's near the kitchen, warm enough for little ones." Henry nodded. His voice, when it came, was rough but firm. "See to it, Mrs. Keene. They'll rest here tonight." As she led the children upstairs, Lily turned at the door. Her tiny voice drifted back across the parlor. "Thank you, sir." Henry looked up at her, and for the first time in years, something softened in his expression. "You're welcome, child." When they were gone, he sat before the fire long into the night, the storm still roaring beyond the windows. He thought of Daniel, of Mary, of the life he'd once lived and the promises he'd broken. The sound of rain against the glass became like a heartbeat, steady, insistent, impossible to ignore, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of grief and silence, The lonely Baron felt the faint stir of something he thought long dead. Hope. Spring came slowly to Hollow Creek. The snows melted from the hills, the rivers swelled, and the fields glistened green again. The manor, once wrapped in silence, now breathed like a living thing. Birds nested in the eaves, horses neighed in the pastures, and the sound of children's laughter rang out like music. For the first time in many years, Henry Alcott, the once lonely Baron, felt as though his house had a pulse again. He rose each day with purpose. He taught Thomas how to mend fences, how to ride with a steady hand, and how to read a trail. The boy was eager to learn, determined to earn his keep, and full of that quiet pride Henry remembered so well in Daniel Harper, his father. Lily, small and soft-spoken, followed Mrs. Keene like a second shadow, carrying flowers into the kitchen and humming old songs her mother had taught her. It was, for a while, a peaceful rhythm, but peace has a way of drawing shadows. It began one morning in town. Henry had ridden into Ridge Hollow to collect supplies, leaving Thomas to tend the horses. While he spoke with the general store's clerk, he noticed a man lingering by the door, a tall drifter with a scar along his jaw and eyes that watched too long. When Henry left, the man followed him with a stare that sent a cold prickle down his neck. That night, when the Baron returned, Mrs. Keene met him at the gate, flustered. "There was a man here," she said, her hands wringing her apron. Asked about the children. Said he was kin to them. Henry's brow darkened. Did he give his name? Said he was their uncle. Name of Eli Harper. Henry felt the weight of the name sink in. He remembered hearing of Daniel's younger brother, reckless, trouble with cards and drink. A man who'd been chased out of town more than once. He'd never lifted a finger to help his brother's widow. Yet now he was sniffing around for the children. Henry's instincts, long dulled, sharpened again. That evening, after supper, he sat Thomas down. The boy looked uneasy as Henry asked, "Do you know a man named Eli Harper?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Uncle Eli came by after Mama got sick. Said he'd take us to the city. Mama said no. She didn't trust him. Said he just wanted Pa's money." Henry's jaw tightened. "He's not taking you anywhere, lad." "Not while I draw breath." Thomas met his eyes. "We don't want to go, sir. We want to stay here." Henry reached across the table, resting a rough, steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then here is where you'll stay." The next few days brought tension to the air. The Baron doubled the stable locks, sent word to the ranch hands to keep watch, and made sure the children never went far alone. But even caution couldn't stop the storm that was building. It came late one evening when the moon hung low and silver over the fields. A pounding at the door broke the calm. When Henry opened it, Eli Harper stood there, unkempt, his coat dusty, a sneer curling his lips. "You've got something that belongs to me," Eli said, his voice slick with arrogance. "My brother's kids. They belong to no one," Henry replied, his tone low and sharp. "They're under my protection now." Eli stepped closer, the stench of whiskey heavy on his breath. "You think you can hide them from blood? I'll be back for them, old man. You can count on that." Henry didn't flinch. "Then you best bring your courage with you, because I'll be waiting." Eli's grin faded. He spat on the ground, turned, and strode into the darkness. When the door closed, Henry leaned against it, his hand trembling slightly. Behind him, Thomas and Lily stood at the edge of the hall, their faces pale but trusting. Henry straightened, his expression hardening like iron. "It's all right," he said softly. "He won't hurt you. Not while I'm here." But deep in his gut, the Baron knew the truth. Eli Harper would return. And when he did, the ghosts of the past wouldn't be the only things Henry had to face. The following week, Hollow Creek held its breath. The hills were quiet, the nights longer, and every creak of the wind sounded like a warning. Henry Alcott knew Eli Harper hadn't gone far. Men like him never did. They lingered, waiting for darkness or opportunity. And so the Baron prepared. He hadn't lifted a rifle in years, but now he oiled his old Winchester and checked every round. He ordered the ranch hands, most of them loyal men who'd worked his land before his long silence, to return. They came without question, sensing their employer was once again the man they'd respected years ago. The manor, once idle and forgotten, came alive with activity. Horses were moved into the inner corral, lanterns were hung, and every man was told to keep watch until dawn. Thomas tried to act brave, but Henry saw the worry behind his eyes. The boy shadowed him wherever he went, refusing to sit idle. "I can help, sir," he insisted. "Pa taught me how to shoot a little. Henry placed a hand on his shoulder. You've got your father's courage, lad, but I'll do the fighting if it comes to that. Your job is to keep your sister safe. Understand? Thomas nodded, though reluctance flickered in his eyes. Yes, sir. That night a storm brewed again over the ridge, distant thunder rolling low like the growl of something restless. Henry stood by the window, his cane resting against the wall, his rifle across his lap. The house was quiet but alert. Mrs. Keene and Lily slept in the back room. Thomas dozed beside the hearth, his small hand gripping the pocket watch the Baron had given him. Then came the sound. Hooves. Several of them. Slow, deliberate crunching through the wet dirt outside. Henry's pulse steadied. He rose, checked his weapon, and moved toward the door. When he stepped onto the porch, the night wind whipped his coat. The moon was thin behind the clouds, and in that faint light he saw them. 3 riders, one of them Eli Harper, sitting tall and mean in the saddle. The others were rough men, armed and grinning. Well now, Eli called out, his voice dripping mockery. Didn't think you'd have the guts to face me, old man. Henry stepped forward, every inch the Baron once more. Shoulders straight, eyes hard. You're trespassing on my land, Harper. Turn around and go before you regret it. Eli spat into the dirt. Those kids are blood. You think you can hide them behind your fancy title? You're nothing but a ghost in a big house. Henry raised his rifle, the barrel gleaming faintly. I've lived with ghosts a long time, Harper, but I'll not let one more child suffer because of my mistakes. You come for them, and you'll answer to me. The rider shifted uneasily. Even in the dim light, there was something in the Baron's stance, a quiet authority that made lesser men hesitate. Eli sneered. You wouldn't dare shoot me. Henry's voice dropped to a low, steady growl. Try me. The standoff stretched tight as wire. A gust of wind tore across the yard, snapping Eli's coat. His hand twitched toward his revolver, but Henry's shot rang first. The echo thundered across the hills. Eli's hat flew from his head as the bullet grazed the brim, close enough to send him reeling back in shock. Next one won't miss, Henry said coldly. The men with Eli exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered, Let's go, Eli. Ain't worth it. Eli glared at Henry, fury burning in his eyes, but fear tempered it. This ain't over, he spat, then turned his horse sharply and rode off into the darkness. The others followed. When the last hoofbeat faded, Henry lowered his rifle slowly. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything he'd just defended. Behind him, the door creaked open. Thomas stood there, pale but wide-eyed. You scared them off, he whispered. Henry turned, his expression softening. No, lad, he said quietly. We scared them off. He placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder and looked toward the horizon where the first streaks of dawn were breaking. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace, not the hollow kind born of solitude, but the earned peace of a man who'd finally kept his promise. The dawn that followed was soft and golden, spilling through the manor's tall windows and chasing away the night's shadows. The storm clouds had scattered, leaving Hollow Creek washed and calm. But inside the Baron's chest, a storm still lingered, quiet, heavy, and full of memories. Henry sat at the kitchen table, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him, untouched now but still within reach. Across from him, Thomas and Lily ate their breakfast sleepily, their eyes puffy from the long night. Mrs. Keene busied herself at the stove, pretending not to notice the tension that still clung to the room like smoke. When the children finished, Henry spoke softly. Thomas, Lily, come sit with me for a moment. Thomas straightened immediately, sensing the gravity in the Baron's tone, and guided his sister to the chair beside him. Henry looked at them both for a long moment, the boy's brave eyes, the girl's small hands folded neatly on her lap. How young they were, yet how much loss they had already known. I owe you both a truth, Henry began. His voice was low but steady. About your father. And about me. Thomas frowned slightly. You knew him, didn't you, sir? Henry nodded. Yes, better than most. Your father, Daniel Harper, worked for me many years ago. He was my foreman and my friend, one of the finest men I ever knew. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window, as though the past were written in the mist outside. When bandits raided this land, he stood between me and death. Took a bullet meant for me. He died saving my life. Lily's eyes widened. Our pa saved you? Henry nodded again, a tightness catching in his throat. He did. And before he passed, I gave him my word that I'd look after his family. But He stopped, his hand trembling slightly. I didn't keep that promise. When my own family died soon after, I lost myself. I shut everyone out, including you. Silence filled the kitchen, thick and still. Thomas's small voice finally broke it. Mama said you weren't a bad man. Just a sad one. Henry looked up sharply, the words striking deeper than any bullet. She said that? Thomas nodded. She said you once helped Pa when nobody else would. That you gave him work even when times were bad. She said you were kind, just hurt. For a long moment, Henry could only stare at the boy. He'd spent so many years believing his failures had erased every good thing he'd ever done. Yet here, in these children's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in himself for years. Mercy. I failed your mother and father, he said quietly, but I won't fail you. He stood, went to the mantel and took down a framed photograph, faded but clear enough to see two men standing side by side, smiling beneath the Texas sun. He handed it to Thomas. That's your Pa and me. We built this place together. Thomas traced the photo's edge with his fingers, reverent. He looked strong. He was, Henry said softly. And now it's my turn to be strong for you. Lily's eyes shimmered. She rose from her chair, walked to the Baron, and without a word wrapped her tiny arms around his leg. The gesture startled him so much that for a moment he couldn't move. Then he reached down and lifted her into his arms, his rough hands trembling. She rested her head against his chest and whispered, "Thank you, Uncle Henry." The name hit him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Uncle Henry, not Baron, not Sir. Family. Thomas stood too, holding the photo tight against his chest. "We'll help you, sir, Uncle Henry. We can work the ranch with you, can't we?" Henry smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes wet.
"Aye, lad."
"We'll rebuild it together, all of us." And in that quiet kitchen, with morning light warming the floor and the ghosts of the past finally laid to rest, Henry Alcott felt the weight of years lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a very long time, the lonely Baron was not alone anymore. The days that followed changed everything at Hollow Creek Manor. The silence that once haunted its long halls was replaced by laughter. Soft at first, uncertain like a song forgotten but slowly remembered. The lonely Baron, Henry Alcott, found himself waking early, not to the weight of grief, but to the sound of small footsteps running down the stairs and the smell of biscuits baking in Mrs. Keene's kitchen. Thomas had taken to shadowing Henry wherever he went, out to the stables, into the fields, along the fences that stretched for miles across the land. The boy's eyes burned with a quiet determination, the same fierce light Henry had once seen in Daniel Harper, his late friend, and Lily, sweet timid Lily, had filled the manor with her laughter, chasing her doll across the wide veranda or humming to herself as she braided Mrs. Keene's gray hair. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the far ridges, painting the valley in hues of amber and rose, Henry stood by the corral, watching Thomas wrestle with a stubborn young colt. The boy's hat slipped down over his eyes and he laughed, struggling to stay upright. "Easy there, lad," Henry called. "Don't pull against him, feel his rhythm. Let him trust you first." Thomas nodded, correcting his grip, and soon enough the colt stilled beneath his hand. Henry smiled. It had been years since anyone had worked that corral. Years since the air had felt alive with such purpose. He turned as Lily came skipping toward him, her small hands holding a bunch of wildflowers. "For you, Uncle Henry," she said, thrusting them up to him. "Mrs. Keene says flowers make sad people happy." Henry took them carefully, his rough fingers brushing against hers. "Do I look sad to you?" Lily tilted her head, thinking. "Not anymore." He chuckled softly, tucking the flowers into the top buttonhole of his vest. "Then you must be some kind of miracle worker, Miss Lily." The little girl giggled and ran off again, calling for her brother. Henry watched them both, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. That evening, they all gathered in the parlor. Mrs. Keene brought in a pot of stew and Thomas set the table with clumsy care. Lily insisted on saying grace, her voice trembling slightly but full of innocence. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for food, for Uncle Henry, and for Mama and Papa watching us from heaven." Henry bowed his head, tears stinging his eyes. When she finished, he reached across the table and took both children's hands. "You two have brought life back into this old house," he said softly. "And into me," Thomas smiled. Mama said people can find new homes if they just keep walking long enough. Maybe we walked here for a reason. Henry's voice thickened. Maybe I was waiting for you. They ate in warm silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, shadows dancing softly across the walls. When the meal was done, Henry rose and walked to the old piano in the corner. It had been silent for 15 years, its keys gathering dust. He brushed a hand across them and sat down. He hesitated, then began to play, a slow, gentle tune his wife used to love. The melody filled the room, wrapping around the children like a lullaby. Lily rested her head on Thomas's shoulder, eyes drifting closed. When the last note faded, Henry turned to see both children asleep by the fire, their faces peaceful. He stood quietly, draped a blanket over them, and whispered the words that had been waiting in his heart since the night they'd knocked on his door. "You're home now." He lingered for a moment, watching the flames dance and the soft rise and fall of the children's breathing. Outside, the wind moved gently through the oaks, whispering through the valley that had once echoed only with loneliness. Now it carried laughter, warmth, and life once more, and in that quiet moment, the lonely Baron of Hollow Creek was lonely no longer.